All right, I'm going to start this morning with a biology quiz, pop quiz. How do mammals breathe? Jeff? Through their lungs. We inhale air through our nose and our mouth. It goes into our lungs, and those lungs get the oxygen out of the air, and then we exhale out the carbon dioxide. Awesome. How about fish? How do fish breathe? Oh, that's a lot of answers at once. Somebody knew. They have gills. They take in, not air, but what? Water right through their mouth, the same way we take in air. That water goes through their gills, and the gills take out the oxygen, and then push out everything else back into the water. A human can't breathe water. You've all told your kids that, I'm sure. Don't try it. It's not good. A fish can't breathe air. You've all seen a fish when it's pulled out of the water, flapping around. It's trying to get back in the water as soon as it can, because it can't breathe the air. Did you know, though, that there are fish who have evolved to survive a long time outside of water? Some of these fish have actually learned to absorb water through their skin, so that even if they can't breathe water, there's enough water to drink. So they can still breathe even when there's not enough water for them to drink. They might bury themselves in the mud of an empty lake bed, and they can, through their skin, extract water out of the mud. They might even be able to survive in the humidity in the air. They could extract water from humidity. And there's one kind of fish, the lungfish, who, you might guess, has gills and lungs. It can breathe both water and air. Why in the world am I telling you this? What in the world do air-breathing fish have to do with Paul's letter to the Romans? It's a very good question. But first, let's have a little flashback. For those who haven't been here the past 2 Sundays, we are now about halfway through a 5-week sermon series that we're calling a Roman holiday. We started with a scenic overlook, an introduction to Paul's letter to the Christians in Rome. Last week we looked at what Romans has meant to individuals, the conviction that we are saved by grace through Jesus Christ, and not by our own merit or by good works. Rachel did a great job of explaining to our children just now what it means to be saved by God's grace. And that is a truth that has had a profound impact on many lives and really on the whole world. We talked about that last week. In our American culture, though, I think that focus on how God works with us as individuals to save us can get overblown a little bit. Not just in matters of faith, but really our individualism gets overblown in all kinds of aspects of our life together. If you think about it, capitalism has really become about how much personal wealth one person can get, instead of ensuring the financial well-being of maybe the whole community. And our democracy has really become a lot about how we protect our individual rights, my rights, instead of making sure everybody's rights work together for the common good. And the religious side of that is that salvation has become all about me and my personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That kind of individualism is in the air we breathe in the American culture. It can be hard to recognize that there could even be another option. But just like there is more to the city of Rome than the Colosseum, there's more to Romans than individual salvation. And that's where we're headed today, into those neighborhoods of Rome, as I've been describing them, the places where the tourists hardly ever visit, but where most of the everyday Romans live and work and play. We're heading to an understanding of Romans that's about something other than individual salvation. And I think trying to stretch out of our individualistic worldview is a little bit difficult. Maybe like trying to grow gills and learning to breathe in the water. I think we should try. Now, those of you who were not born and raised in the United States, you already have an edge on those of us who are culturally American. You already have both lungs and gills, as it were. You already know two different ways of being. I was actually talking to one of the nieces in the Kingston family last night about this. You already know the American way and the way of your native culture. And in my experience, that other way is far less interested in the individual than it is in the family or the community. You experience the differences in these worldviews when you travel back to Cambodia or to Cameroon or wherever your family is from, and you find that your friends and your family there have expectations of you that you almost forgot about while you were living here in the United States. Expectations about who cares for whom and who provides what for the family and how decisions are made. Sometimes maybe there's frustration at siblings or cousins who have cast off their responsibilities to the family or the community in favor of individual pursuits. Is that accurate? Yeah? And on the flip side, I think you experience the fullness of your otherness here at your home in America when you're constantly having to explain whether something is Cameroonian time or American time. Or when you have to remind your children, who are a little more American than you are, about how your culture expects you to treat and take care of their elders. I bet some of you have wondered and worried whether your children will care for you in your old age the same way you have cared for your elders. Is that accurate? Lungs and gills, air and water. Two ways of breathing, of being. So let's go back to Romans. Paul is coming from an early Christianity that has been mostly Jewish. These earliest Christians, they followed Jesus, but they also continued to study the Torah, to circumcise their boys, to observe their traditional dietary restrictions, to keep the Sabbath, as they had always done. They assumed that since God made an eternal covenant with Abraham, that since the Messiah came from Israel, anyone who wanted to follow Jesus would also need to become part of the Abrahamic covenant, that is, to become Jewish. Jewishness was the air that they breathed. They could not imagine any other way of belonging to God than the Jewish way. But Paul had been spending most of his time among Greeks or Gentiles. It's really just a way of saying everybody who's not Jewish. And Paul's Jewish lungs were evolving. Or maybe you could say that Paul was evolving to have both lungs and gills. He could breathe air and water. He was beginning to understand that God could bring Gentiles into the covenant without their first becoming Jewish. What we see in Romans, and especially that really confusing part of Romans 4 that we read a little bit ago, is Paul trying to explain how Gentiles could be part of the family of God without studying the Torah or circumcising their boys or keeping dietary restrictions or observing the Sabbath the way the Jews did. And here I don't think Paul is so much interested in how individual Gentiles get saved as he is with trying to explain that God is really confounding a Jewish worldview that understood Jewishness and Judaism as the only way to be in relationship with God. Gentiles are also children of Abraham, Paul says, because Abraham had faith even before he was circumcised, even before he obeyed God. Gentiles who have faith in Jesus are therefore also children of Abraham, while at the same time remaining Gentiles. That's a pretty big deal for a church that had been breathing Jewish air for all of its young life. So what does it mean for the church today? First, I think it means we can and we should re-examine some of the cultural aspects of Christianity that got packaged up when the Christian faith was carried from Europe to Africa and Asia and the Americas in the 17th century and beyond. So many of those missionaries were convinced that being Christian also meant adopting Western cultural values. Things like the use of liturgy in worship, monogamy in marriage, still circumcision of young boys, certain kinds of appropriate dress, especially for women, ending the veneration of ancestors. If you wanted to be Christian, they taught, you needed to adopt those Western ideas and habits. And lots of converts to Christianity all over the world did adopt Western ideas and habits and left behind these things that the missionaries said, you can't do those anymore, you can't be like that anymore. But some of them found themselves feeling like fish out of water. Some evolved to breathe that Western air, but they always knew that they were still somehow other among the Europeans who came preaching the good news. So I think a wider reading of Romans invites us to see that Christianity is not a Western religion any more than it was a Jewish religion. All are justified freely by God's grace through Jesus Christ. Jews as Jews by faith. Gentiles as Gentiles by faith. Europeans as Europeans by faith. Africans of every ethnic group as Africans by faith. Cambodians, Southeast Asians as such by faith. You do not have to leave your culture to follow Christ and to belong to the family of God. And where the church has forced people to do so, it's time for us to repent and to do the work of helping reclaim cultural practices that have been lost or threatened because of an imperialistic style of Western Christianity. The other thing a wider reading of Romans invites us to do is to consider who might be excluded from the family of God today, because they are forced to conform with insider views of what it means to belong to the family of God. In other words, how has today's church become like the Jewish Christians who said to their Gentile brethren, if you have to be like us if you want to belong to God? How might God be at work to confound our worldview, to open our minds to other ways of being Christian, of being Christ followers? I think an important place to look at that question is in some of the cultural shifts that are happening in our society now. Younger generations, especially millennials and younger, they have more open ideas about marriage, about sexuality, about gender identity. They are less convinced that capitalism is the only good economic system. They're deeply aware of injustice, both at the individual and at the systemic level. They move around a lot. They're less likely to join a church. And the church has generally defended an older generation's way of being as normative to the Christian faith. But I think it's time to ask whether those ideas are inherent to what it means to be a Christian, period, or are they inherent to what it meant to be a Christian in the 20th century? And could we imagine a new generation of 21st century Jesus followers who are not necessarily married or straight or cisgendered? Could we imagine a faith that is not indebted to capitalism? Could we imagine a way of following Jesus that doesn't depend on institutions? These are big questions. Some of them it's probably not quite safe even to ask out loud. But let's go back to something small. The respiratory systems of fish and mammals. Fish breathe in the water. Mammals breathe in the air. But did you notice in our biology quiz back at the beginning that whether they get it from the air or they get it from the water, fish and mammals both need oxygen to survive. The life force is the same. Life force is the same. Sometimes I feel a little bit like a lungfish. I love the church of my grandparents. It's the air I grew up breathing. But I'm someone who is on the cusp of generations, just a little on the young side to be Gen X, a little too old to be a millennial. And in that in-between place, I feel like I know a little bit about how to breathe in the air and how to breathe in the water. I don't think an older generation of air-breathing traditionalists have to become water-breathing millennials, but nor do I think that the Bible requires water-breathing millennials to become air-breathing traditionalists either. In fact, I think you can read Romans as a call to give up all of those cultural and generational trappings of our religion and to have faith that the life source is the same. It is God's grace in Jesus Christ that sustains us. That is the grace that saves all of us as we are. The greatest generation as the greatest generation. The boomers as the boomers, the millennials as the millennials, Europeans as Europeans, Africans of every ethnic group as Africans, Cambodians and Southeast Asians as Cambodians and Southeast Asians, and all of it by faith in the grace of Jesus Christ. Now, one of the gifts of being part of a multicultural and a multi-generational church is that it helps all of us remember that there is more than one way of being in the world. We observe and we interact with one another and we go, oh yeah, that's a different culture than mine. They breathe air, I breathe water. They're Cambodian, I'm American, they're a millennial, I'm older than that. There's no value judgment here, right? It's not like mammals are inherently better than fish. It's not like lungs are inherently better than gills. Lungs are only better than gills if you breathe from the air. We're different. We're different culturally, ethnically, we're different generationally. But our need for God's grace is the same. And the miracle of grace is this: we receive it just the way we are, with our cultural understandings, with our ethnic backgrounds, with our generational, with what comes from us generationally. We receive God's grace as we are. But we find that grace changes us into something new. And that's not to say that it changes us into someone else's idea of what a Christian is supposed to be. Grace changes us into the people we were created to be, a people in the likeness of Christ. In the likeness of Christ. May you know the grace of God today. The grace of God in Jesus Christ that claims you just the way you are, as part of a culture, as part of a generation, as part of a community. And may that grace transform you. May that grace transform all of us together so that we can be the body of Christ in the world. What a beautiful thing that would be. May it be so. Amen.